Hello and welcome to my video all about how to knit a pumpkin. Because of their round shape, pumpkins are usually knit using the circular knitting method. However, in this pattern I've made it more beginner friendly by using flat knitting. It's a really simple project to do because you're basically just knitting a rectangle shape and you can make the finished pumpkin any size you like. To make my pumpkin I used pretty much all of a 50-gram ball of chunky acrylic yarn. For the needles, I'm using 8mm needles, and even though we're not circular knitting, I'm still going to be using circular needles. This is simply because I won't be able to fit all the stitches on straight needles. One thing that I would recommend is to use a light coloured yarn, and this is simply because very small amounts of the stuffing inside will be visible from the outside, and the stuffing will most likely be white. On my pumpkin, you can hardly notice that you can see a tiny bit of the stuffing because of the light colour of the yarn, but a dark colour yarn would make the stuffing more noticeable. In order to minimise this effect, you can always use a smaller needle size than what's recommended for the yarn that you've chosen. This will bring the stitches closer together and that will hide the stuffing a bit better. Okay, so to make the same pumpkin size that I've made, you need to cast on 42 stitches. If you want to make a different size, just make sure that you cast on a multiple of 4 stitches plus 2. As you can see, I'm just using the long tail cast on method. Then for row 1 of the pattern, which is the right side, you need to begin with 2 knit stitches. Then bring the yarn between the needles from the back to the front and do 2 purl stitches. Always make sure that the working yarn is at the back away from you for a knit stitch and at the front towards you for a purl stitch. And then you simply repeat this across the row. So take the yarn to the back and do 2 knit stitches. And then bring the yarn to the front and do 2 purl stitches. And so on. And you're going to end this row on 2 knit stitches. What we're knitting here is actually 2x2 ribbing, which is a very popular knitting stitch. It's made up of raised knit stitch ridges and sunken purl stitch valleys. If you just take a little look at the stitches below your right hand needle here, you can see that every other pair of stitches has a little bump of yarn. These bumps of yarn are called purl bumps, and so every stitch with a purl bump is a purl stitch, and every stitch without a purl bump is a knit stitch. The reason I'm pointing this out is because if you ever get lost in the pattern and you don't know what stitch is next, then just look at the stitches on your left hand needle. If the stitch you're about to work has a little purl bump on it, then you have to do a purl stitch. If it doesn't have a purl bump, then you need to do a knit stitch. And that's because in order to do ribbing, you always knit the knits and purl the purls. Then for row number 2, you need to start by purling 2 stitches. Then take the yarn to the back and do 2 knit stitches. And you just carry on like this all across the row. So bring the yarn to the front and purl 2. Take the yarn to the back and knit 2. And so on. And you'll finish by purling 2 stitches. And that's it, that's the 2-row pattern repeat. If you take a look at the knitting now, you can already see the ribbed effect appearing, with the raised knit stitch ridges and the sunken purl stitch valleys. Then you just need to repeat these 2 rows until you have a rectangle of knitting just like this. For me, this was after 17 rows. This rectangle doesn't have to be any particular size, you just want it to be this general shape. So once you have this shape, make sure to cut off the excess yarn to leave you with a yarn tail that's about 8 times the length of your knitting. As you will see, I left my yarn tail a little bit too long, but it doesn't really matter. You'll then need to feed this yarn tail into a yarn needle, like so. Then take this yarn needle all the way through the stitches on your needle. Make sure you start on the side where the yarn tail leaves the knitting. So just feed the yarn needle through a handful of stitches at a time. And repeat this for all the stitches. It's easiest to do this whilst all the stitches are on the cable, because that gives you a little bit more room. In most pumpkin patterns, you'll need to bind off the edge instead, but I find this method a little bit quicker. Once you've done that, you can take out your knitting needle, and it's likely you'll be able to unscrew the needle like I can to make it a lot easier. You should then be able to pull on the yarn tail to gather up the edge, like so. Pull on the yarn to gather up the edge as tightly as possible, but of course be careful not to damage or break your yarn. If I turn this knitting inside out now, you can see that along the shorter edges are those sunken purl valleys, and you can tell this by those wavy stitches. However, for the next step, we don't want the purl valleys along the edges. Instead, we want the raised stockinette ridges. So just make sure that you arrange the knitting so that the stockinette stitch edges are facing you. We're now going to join these edges together in a seam using the mattress stitch. First, you need to identify the edge stitches. These are the little V-shaped stitches that are all along both edges. Next to these edge stitches are little horizontal strands of yarn that look a bit like a ladder. These strands are what we're going to be using to join these edges together. So take your yarn needle to the opposite edge to where the yarn tail leaves your knitting, and then find the lowest rung of the yarn ladder. So that's the horizontal bar of yarn near the bottom of the knitting. Then cross over to the other edge and pick up the next rung of the ladder. Then go over to the other edge again and pick up the next horizontal strand. And just keep repeating this all the way along the edges. You can do this stitch quite loosely, and then every inch or so you'll need to pull on the yarn parallel to the seam to bring the edges together, like so. Just make sure that after you tighten the mattress stitch, you stretch the seam perpendicular and parallel to the seam just to loosen that yarn up again, because you don't want this too tight. Just note that I have a separate video all about the mattress stitch if you want a slower demo. Once you get to the end, make sure that you take your needle through the corner of each edge. To finish, just tighten the yarn and stretch the seam again parallel to the seam and perpendicular to the seam. So now basically what we have is a little knitted pot, and to close up the open edge we now need to do a running stitch around this edge. So make sure that your yarn is on the outside of your knitting, and then go into and out of the knitting, like so, one row from the edge. You want to try and pick up 2 strands of yarn each time, and you want to make these stitches parallel to the edge. So go into the knitting and out, picking up 2 strands of yarn, and pull the yarn tail through. Then into and out of the knitting, and pull the yarn tail through, and so on all of the way around. As you can see, if you now pull on this yarn, it gathers the edge together. You'll see that I alternate between doing a stitch in the purl stitch valley and then a stitch in the knit stitch ridge, then a stitch in the purl valley, then a stitch in the knitted ridge, and I just do that all the way around. Once you've got back to where you started, then take your yarn from the front to the back of the knitting like so, and then you can fill this pumpkin with the stuffing. So all you do is just put some polyester toy stuffing inside as much as you want, and just make sure it's not lumpy. Once you've done that, you can then pull on the yarn tail like so to gather that top edge together. It's up to you what you want to use for the stalk. I just cut out a long rectangle of felt, added glue and then rolled it up. But you could use knitted I-cord or a twig, or you could sew your own out of some fabric. It's completely up to you. You want to gather the top edge around your stalk tightly, like so. Or you could completely close up the gap and then sew the stalk on top. Push the yarn needle down through the centre of the pumpkin so that it comes out the opening in the base. As you can see, when you pull on the yarn tail, it changes the shape of the pumpkin, so you can decide what shape you want your pumpkin to be. To close up the opening in the base, you just need to do another running stitch. But this time we're going to take the yarn needle under a single strand of yarn, and we're going to do this every couple of stitches or so. So go under one strand of yarn and pull the yarn tail through, and then under another single strand and pull the yarn tail through, and under another strand, and so on, all the way around the opening. Once you've finished, pull on the yarn to close the opening, and then you need to secure this yarn. So take your yarn needle under another single strand of yarn and pull the yarn tail until there's just a small loop remaining. Take your yarn needle through this loop and tighten. And then repeat this again. Then take your needle through the centre of the pumpkin again, out through the opening at the top. It's then completely up to you how you finish your pumpkin and add the stalk. You can use this yarn tail to sew up the opening and then sew on your stalk. You could cut off the yarn and maybe glue the stalk into the opening. Or like me, you could take the yarn through the centre of the stalk, like so. I then push the stalk down the yarn, add a dab of glue, and then release the stalk. And this brings a bit of the glue and the yarn down through the centre of the stalk, therefore securing it in place. Once the glue dried, I cut off the excess yarn. And here it is, my finished pumpkin. This pumpkin doesn't take very long at all, and I really hope that this video has inspired you to give it a try. As always, I hope you found this tutorial useful, and thank you very much for watching.